We're just hours away from the latest deadline in the rolling debacle that is Donald Trump's self-inflicted trade war. At midnight tonight, Trump's latest round of disastrous global tariffs are set to kick in. And since we've been here before, we know that means Trump is either about to chicken out again or crash the stock market or a combination of the two. And in the lead up to this latest deadline, Trump has insisted that he is not changing his mind this time. But tonight, on the eve of this deadline, Trump released a new order announcing brand new, completely made up tariff rates, probably with the same fake equation that he's used before, for a whole host of different countries. And shocker, these new tariffs make even less sense than before.
With only a few hours left before one of the most controversial trade policies of former President Donald Trump officially takes effect, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. is no different from a pressure cooker about to explode. Urgent news lines continuously appear on major television channels in the United States as the White House suddenly announces a new decree on tariffs, a document with entirely new tariff levels, not through Congress, not based on a clear formula, and above all, continuing to stir chaos in the global economy. At midnight tonight, the next round of tariffs in the spontaneous trade war launched by Mr. Trump will be activated, prominently featuring an increase in tariffs on goods from Canada from 25% to 35%. But paradoxically, exempting most of the items that Canada actually exports to the United States, a move that experts describe as both irrational, meaningless, and potentially unforeseeable consequences. Not only investors are holding their breath, small businesses in America, from family farms in Ohio to manufacturing companies in Michigan, are reeling in the vortex of policy instability because this is not the first time Trump has threatened tariffs, nor the first time he suddenly changes his decision at the last minute. Financial markets have witnessed indices plummeting just because of a tweet or a hot statement on trade from this former president. This time, Trump asserts he will not back down, but at the same time, he signs an entirely new decree, not only failing to provide a reasonable explanation for the tariff imposition, but also invoking emergency situations that change daily. Yesterday, it was trade balance. Today, it's fentanyl smuggling. Tomorrow, it could be a diplomatic retaliation against Canada for recognizing Palestine. The use of executive power to impose tariffs arbitrarily has sparked a serious legal debate, not only economically, but also about constitutional order. Amid this storm, a small ray of hope emerges. At the Federal Court of Appeals this morning, a hearing took place to consider whether Trump exceeded his authority by unilaterally imposing a series of tariffs without going through Congress. The body constitutionally granted legislative power, including the power to impose taxes. Sharp questions from the judges show growing skepticism about the legality of Mr. Trump's actions. Could this be a turning point to prevent a president from acting like a monarch, disregarding democratic processes? The fierce legal battle, market instability, and big questions about presidential power all are intersecting at the hotspot of the American economy. And as the clock counts down to the tariff imposition moment, the entire nation once again asks itself, who is really running U.S. economic policy, and how high will the price be for unilateral decisions? Meaningless tariffs and long-term consequences. As the clock hands gradually approach midnight, the time when the new tariffs issued by Donald Trump officially take effect, economic observers at home and abroad are anxiously waiting to see what will actually happen. But instead of the transparency or rationality often seen in trade policies, this time, America and the world are facing a hastily signed decree containing illogical changes and even internal contradictions. One of the most notable points is the decision to increase tariffs on imported goods from Canada from 25% to 35%. However, the decree simultaneously exempts most of Canada's main export items to the United States, leading many trade experts to call this a political performance rather than a serious trade policy. Not stopping there. The new tariffs are also criticized as fabricated when they come without clear databases or transparent calculation formulas. It's all as if he picked numbers out of his head and put them into the decree. An anonymous former trade official commented, Trump's trade strategy not only leaves allies in a bewildering position, but also continuously puts U.S. businesses in a state where they cannot plan long-term. The reasons for imposing tariffs changing constantly from rebalancing trade to fentanyl crisis. Or recently, to punish Canada for its diplomatic stance on Palestine, has made U.S. trade policy unprecedentedly unstable. An expert from the Peterson Institute for International Economics described, "No one knows what reason Trump will invoke tomorrow to impose more taxes. In this way, he is turning trade policy into a personal power game, not a strategic economic tool." Meanwhile, financial markets fluctuate with every piece of news from the White House. Every time Trump mentions taxes or trade penalties, major stock indices react as if there's an earthquake. Sudden decisions not only erode investor confidence but also force multinational companies to reconsider their entire supply chains. From Asia to Europe, the danger lies in the fact that, even though these tariff waves are imposed under the guise of protecting national security, Mr. Trump himself has never clearly defined what that threat is. The reasons change daily, but the damage accumulates hourly. With each new decree, thousands of businesses must adjust contracts, reprice products, and even cut staff to survive this prolonged period of instability. And the most worrying thing is, this is not the first action, nor is it certain to be the last. In an environment where one person can unilaterally decide tax policy with just a signature, the system of power checks, the foundation of American democracy, is facing its greatest challenge ever: direct burden on the pockets of Americans. If the sudden statements and inconsistent behavior of Donald Trump create a wave of anxiety among policymakers, then for American people and businesses, the consequences are clearly manifested in the cold numbers on monthly living bills and financial books. According to the analysis presented at the federal hearing this morning, the tariffs unilaterally issued by Trump during his term have created the largest indirect tax increase since President Bill Clinton in 1993. Specifically, Americans are bearing an average of at least $1,300 more per year in consumer costs, a figure enough to erode the budgets of middle-income households. Lawyer Neil Katyal, representing the business coalition suing Trump, emphasized, "This is not an abstract legal debate. This is the story of every consumer, every factory, every family being forced to bear the costs of an unclear policy without congressional approval." Not only consumers are affected, American businesses, especially small and medium-sized ones, are facing a double challenge: sharply increased input material costs due to taxes. While output cannot be raised correspondingly due to the risk of losing market share, the result is reduced profits, staff cuts, and stagnation in expansion investments. An executive director of a mechanical parts manufacturing company in Indiana shared in the local newspaper, "We import steel from Canada to produce products for the domestic market. With the new tax, costs rise up to 20%, but customers won't accept paying more. If the situation continues, we have to close one of our 3 factories." Large corporations with global supply networks are also not immune to the damage. A report from the Brookings Institution shows that in the 3 years after Trump's tariff waves were applied, many U.S. listed companies saw their stocks drop from 5 to 15% due to investor concerns about rising costs and shrinking global markets. The impact also spreads internationally. Traditional U.S. allies, from the European Union, Canada to South Korea, have reacted harshly, even imposing retaliatory taxes. This causes the trade retaliation spiral to continue escalating, leading to chain effects on global supply chains, disrupting production, transportation, and consumption on both sides of the Pacific and Atlantic. Meanwhile, in America, ordinary people are the ones suffering the most damage. Essential items like food, electronics, building materials, which depend on imports, have seen clear price increases. Grocery stores in rural areas, where alternatives are very limited, are forced to raise prices, pushing consumers into a difficult position. Notably, the entire tax increase process occurs without any debate in Congress, where the U.S. Constitution stipulates it is the only body with the power to impose taxes. The absence of power controls not only pushes America into erratic policy situations, but also sets a dangerous precedent for the future. Therefore, The ongoing legal battle is not merely a dispute between the executive and legislative branches, but also a warning about the cost of breaking democratic institutions, where law is replaced by personal will and people become hostages in high-level power calculations, limits on presidential power before a historic ruling. In the context of escalating tensions from unilateral tax policies, a new battlefield is opened, not at borders or markets, but right in the courtroom of the Federal Court of Appeals, where the deepest provisions of the U.S. Constitution are being scrutinized under the light of chaotic reality. The hearing took place in the morning before the new tariffs were activated. Under the presidency of Chief Judge Moore, along with Judges Hughes, Stark, and Dyke, the questions posed to the government side were not only sharp but also clearly showed growing skepticism toward Donald Trump's legal arguments. One judge bluntly raised the issue. The law you cite to justify the president's tariff imposition power doesn't even mention tariffs in any section. Another judge spoke more harshly. It's hard to see that Congress, after years of building the trade tax system, would grant the president the power to erase everything and rewrite it unilaterally from scratch. These statements not only express doubts about the legal basis of the decrees, but also raise deep concerns about the principle of separation of powers, the core foundation of American democracy. Lavier Neal Catel, representing the Suing Business Coalition, used every minute in his presentation to clearly outline the danger in the precedent Trump is trying to establish. We are facing a claim of power unprecedented in 200 years of nation building. Catil emphasized the president, under this interpretation, can unilaterally impose taxes whenever, for any reason, as long as he declares it an emergency. The problem here, as the judges pointed out, is that those emergencies change like the wind. One day, it's trade deficit. Another day, military security, then shifts to fentanyl crisis. The next day, to diplomatic issues with Canada or Brazil. That arbitrariness led the court to liken Trump's tax policy to a shell game on the street, where the ball is always hidden under a constantly changing shell. Katyal did not forget to emphasize a paradox. The decree that Trump signed himself contradicts his own arguments. In this document, Trump admits that trade deficit is a chronic feature of the U.S. economy for the past 50 years, something completely contrary to the legal requirement that only unusual and extraordinary threats can be invoked to issue emergency decrees. In the court's eyes, this is not just an academic debate. The consequences of bypassing Congress to apply unauthorized taxes are too great. It directly affects economic life, legal order, and more dangerously, the limits of executive power. This legal battle has thus gone far beyond an ordinary trade lawsuit. It poses a vital question for American democracy. Can a president grant himself power like feudal kings, where just a nod turns policy, laws, and tariffs according to personal will? The final ruling has not been issued, but the reactions in the hearing show that the Court of Appeals is seriously considering pulling back the balance of power in line with the spirit of the Constitution. And if that happens, this will be a historic legal turning point, not only in tariff issues, but also in reaffirming the limits of presidential power in American democracy, legal shield against unilateral power, in the eye of a storm of an unprecedented legal crisis over executive power in modern U.S. history. A prominent figure has stepped to the forefront. Neal Katyal, former acting Solicitor General of the United States, a leading legal scholar, and one of the most respected legal experts in Washington. In this morning's hearing, Mr. Katyal not only presented sharp arguments, but also demonstrated the role of a Constitution guardian amid turbulent times. As representative for a broad coalition of businesses, from family small traders to large associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he sounded the alarm. If Donald Trump's tariff decrees are not overturned, America will face a dangerous precedent of unlimited presidential power. We are not here to argue philosophy. Katyal said on television after the trial, "We are here for a practical matter. Each arbitrary decree is hurting people, causing billions of dollars in damage to businesses, and distorting how this democracy operates." His words are not empty. Under his leadership, the legal team has collected hundreds of documents, decree copies, statistical evidence of economic damage, all to prove that this is no longer an administrative dispute, but a crisis in governance principles. Katyal emphasized that previous presidents, despite political differences, all respected the basic principle that Congress is the only body with the power to impose taxes. We once fought a war for independence for that reason. No taxation without representation. This citation is not only symbolic, but also hits the concerns of many Americans, that the system of power balance is being eroded by personal ambitions. In a television exchange that evening, Katyal analyzed deeper the risks in the mobile emergency that Trump uses to legitimize the tariffs. One day he invokes drugs. The next day, Palestine. The day after could be stock market drops. If this is the standard, any future president can act the same way. National media quickly described him as a last line of defense between the rule of law and autocratic power. Political commentators compare his role to lawyers who once confronted the government in historic cases like Watergate or Iraq war disputes. In the public eye, he is not just a legal expert, but also a symbol of steadfastness, reason, and ethics amid political chaos. Notably, Katyal once served in the Barack Obama administration, but now he is recognized by both political sides as a reliable voice. His career spans from teaching at Georgetown Law School to representing before the Supreme Court more than 40 times, a record number for a non-official Solicitor General. In this lawsuit, Katyal is not acting alone. He leads a team including constitutional law experts, international trade law specialists, and representatives from reputable economic organizations. They not only argue in court but also try to bring the story to the public, helping Americans understand what they are facing. Not just a price increase on an item, but the risk of turning the presidency into a king with a tax pen in hand. When America loses its leadership role, not just a domestic political crisis, the erratic trade policy under Donald Trump is causing the United States' international position to waver with each unilateral decree, each sudden tariff increase, and each threat of trade sanctions, whether for economic reasons, drugs, or diplomatic stances. The U.S. government is diminishing trust from traditional partners while creating conditions for strategic rivals to rise. Trump's tariff increase on goods imported from Canada, while simultaneously exempting most actually traded items, not only bewilders economic analysts, but also creates strong political reactions in Ottawa. The Canadian government, which has shown restraint multiple times during Trump's first term, now has tougher statements, calling the new trade policies inconsistent, arbitrary, and unacceptable for a long-standing and sustainable bilateral relationship. According to a source from the Canadian Foreign Ministry, the government has convened emergency meetings to discuss countermeasures, including the possibility of reimposing retaliatory taxes on U.S. agricultural products and processed goods. Even there are opinions within Canada's Liberal Party proposing to bring the issue before the World Trade Organization, WTO, accusing the U.S. of violating international trade commitments, European Union, and the risk of global tax war. In Europe, the reaction is no less harsh. After a series of times, Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum under the guise of national security in 2018, the European Union retaliated with corresponding taxes on motorcycles, whiskey, and many iconic American items. Currently, with the new escalation in tariff policy, Brussels officials are discussing an additional tax package worth billions of euros. An anonymous European diplomat said, "We once hoped that after the first term, America would return to its leadership role based on principles and international law. But now, Washington is isolating itself from the system it built after World War II. Brazil and punishment by tax, diplomatic policy, not stopping at economics. Trump is also accused of using tariffs as a diplomatic punishment tool. A typical example is the threat to tax goods from Brazil, said to pressure the government there for prosecuting a political figure close to Trump. This action has faced strong criticism from the international community as it blurs the boundary between trade policy and political interference. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon once stated in a seminar in Seoul, using tariffs to handle international political disagreements is a serious step backward in multilateral relations. It pushes nations into confrontation, instead of cooperation. Ironically, while America's closest allies are taxed, China, the #1 trade rival, exploits the chaos to promote bilateral trade agreements with many nations spurned by the U.S. Beijing has increased its presence in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia with unbound investment and trade packages while promoting its stable, non-interference model. As an opposition to the uncertain policy from the White House, analysts say that in the context of the United States continuously changing policies without continuity, the global economic leadership role it once held is being seriously eroded. Power comes not only from economy or military, but also from the ability to create and maintain order. An unpredictable America is an America hard to trust. An expert at the Council on Foreign Relations commented, unilateral tariff imposition without international mechanisms is gradually isolating America. Just like the 2008 financial crisis, the world once expected America to lead economic recovery, but now, that image is being replaced by an unstable superpower, easily angered and unpredictable. In an increasingly interdependent world, America's loss of leadership role not only affects global trade but also weakens its own resilience to future shocks. As the late President John F. Kennedy once said, unchecked power will lead to its own destruction. A moment of awakening for American democracy, from the courtroom of the Federal Court of Appeals to international halls. Donald Trump's unilateral trade policy has sounded a profound alarm about power, responsibility, and the fragility of seemingly solid institutions at the heart of American democracy. We have witnessed a president granting himself the power to impose massive tariffs without congressional consensus, without legislative processes, without providing a clear definition for the so-called emergency, and each time he invokes a new reason, from trade deficit, fentanyl drugs, to foreign diplomatic actions, people and businesses bear another part of the consequences. No democratic system is built to withstand long-term irrational personal decisions if control mechanisms are not used. In this case, the courts have become the last line of defense, where judges not only rule on legal bases, but also set life and death limits for an unlimited executive power precedent. The story is not just in the numbers: $1,300 in increased costs per year for households, billions of dollars lost for businesses, a series of diplomatic tensions with longtime allies. At its core, this is the story of the spirit of the U.S. Constitution, a document once the world's pride in limiting power and protecting people from autocracy. From the litigation initiated by Neil Katyal to the wave of opposition from the business community and the growing skepticism from the judiciary, one can see an implicit consensus forming that America cannot continue operating in a policy from one person's style. What has happened recently is not only failed economic experiments, but also warnings for the future. The big lesson learned is democratic institutions, no matter how solid, need to be protected, renewed, and reinforced. Congress cannot continue to remain silent when its authority is infringed. The judiciary cannot stand aside when the Constitution is distorted, and the people, above all, need to understand that seemingly distant regulations about separation of powers or legislative authority actually directly affect their monthly bills, jobs, and financial futures. In a world increasingly unstable with autocratic models rising strongly from east to west, a stable, transparent America adhering to the rule of law is what not only Americans but the international community expect. And to achieve that, every unilateral action, even under the name for America, must be scrutinized under the light of law, not the shadow of personal power. The final question posed is, if this is not the time for America to review its legislative power protection mechanisms, then when will it be?